Did I crush a child's heart by telling her I wasn't her father? I'm a 36-year-old man, and several years ago I was engaged to a woman named Melissa, who is now 38. We had been close friends since university before we ever dated. Eventually, our relationship ended because we wanted completely different futures. Melissa dreamed of having multiple children and building a large family, while I was focused on my career and had no desire to become a parent. There was no cheating or major fight involved, so we parted amicably and remained in each other's lives. About a year later, Melissa unexpectedly became pregnant after a brief relationship with a man she met while traveling. The situation fell apart quickly. By the time she discovered she was expecting, the man had already moved overseas, and despite her efforts to contact him, he effectively disappeared from her life. Knowing how overwhelmed she was, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. We had known each other for over a decade, and she had very little family nearby. I helped where I could during the pregnancy, whether that meant driving her to appointments, helping with groceries, or covering expenses when things got tight. After her daughter was born, I remained involved as a family friend. I wasn't a parental figure in my mind, but I was definitely a reliable presence. Fast forward to last weekend. Melissa was working a double shift at the veterinary clinic where she manages the front office, so she asked if I could pick up her 6-year-old daughter from a classmate's birthday sleepover. I agreed. When I arrived, I was chatting with the host grandmother near the front entrance while the kids gathered their belongings upstairs. Through the hallway, I overheard one of the children ask Melissa's daughter who I was. Without hesitation, she replied, "That's my dad." The comment caught me completely off guard. Once we got into my truck and started heading home, I decided it would be better to address it immediately rather than let a misunderstanding continue. I told her gently that I cared about her very much, but I wasn't actually her father. I explained that I was more like a godfather or a family friend who loved spending time with her. The entire mood changed instantly. She went quiet, stared out the window, and barely said a word for the rest of the drive. I assumed she was embarrassed and figured she would move past it after a while. I was very wrong. Later that evening, Melissa called me sounding furious. Apparently, her daughter had spent hours crying in her room and repeatedly asking why I didn't want to be her dad. Melissa accused me of handling the situation insensitively and said I should never have corrected her on my own. She argued that I should have either ignored the comment or spoken to her privately first so they could decide together how to explain things. I pushed back and said I wasn't comfortable allowing a child to believe something that wasn't true, especially when a misunderstanding involved parentage. To me, honesty seemed like the obvious choice. Melissa said the issue wasn't honesty itself, but the timing and the fact that I had addressed a complicated emotional subject without preparing the child for it. She believes I unintentionally shattered a fantasy that had become important to her daughter. Now things are tense between us. I genuinely thought I was doing the responsible thing by correcting a misconception, but seeing how devastated the little girl became has me questioning whether I handled the situation badly. Was I wrong for telling her the truth? Was I wrong for refusing to change rooms after another patient targeted me? I am a 22-year-old woman, and a few months ago I ended up spending nearly a week in a medical centre in Glasgow, Scotland, after developing complications from a severe infection. My condition wasn't considered life-threatening, but the doctors wanted to keep me under observation and administer treatment through N-Women4. Because the ward was busy, I was assigned to a shared room with a woman named Lorraine who looked to be somewhere in her early 60s. During the first day, everything seemed perfectly normal. We exchanged a few polite comments, and I assumed we would simply coexist until one of us was discharged. Things changed the following morning. Lorraine started making passive-aggressive remarks every time she saw me scrolling through my phone. She repeatedly commented that I was far too energetic to be in a hospital and implied that younger people exaggerated their medical issues. At first I ignored it, figuring she was having a rough time herself and didn't want to create tension. A couple of days later, my cousin stopped by after work to visit me. We spent about half an hour talking quietly about family updates and some ridiculous stories from home. For the first time since being admitted, I actually laughed and felt somewhat normal. The moment he left, Lorraine exploded. She accused me of treating the ward like a social club and claimed I had been inconsiderate to everyone around me. I apologized if our conversation had carried farther than I realized, but she kept going. According to her, I was constantly disturbing people with phone calls, messages, and visitors. The reality was that I only spoke with worried relatives a few times each day and have received a total of 2 visitors during my entire stay. That evening, a charge nurse approached my bed and asked if I would be willing to relocate to another room because Lorraine had submitted several complaints about me throughout the week. I was surprised because no member of staff had previously told me I was violating any rules. I asked why I was the one being moved when I hadn't received any warnings and had already unpacked my belongings, medications, books, and personal items. The nurse admitted that the request was mostly being made to avoid further conflict and help maintain harmony on the ward. I declined. I explained that I was comfortable where I was. I had done nothing wrong as far as I knew, and it didn't seem fair to inconvenience me simply because another patient disliked me. The nurse accepted my answer and left. When Lorraine realized I wasn't moving, she became even more upset. She started crying loudly, saying nobody respected her concerns and that people were always choosing younger patients over older ones. The atmosphere became incredibly awkward for the rest of the night. After I was discharged, I told my aunt about what happened. She thought I should have switched rooms just to avoid the confrontation and make my stay easier. Meanwhile, several friends told me that Lorraine had been hostile from the beginning and that giving in would have rewarded her behavior. Now I'm wondering if I was being stubborn. Would it have been easier to simply move, or was I justified in refusing to accommodate someone who seemed determined to find fault with me from the moment we met? Was I wrong for stepping in when a man didn't want to be filmed? I'm a 29-year-old man, and yesterday I was waiting outside a subway station in a busy district of Manchester, England, after finishing a late shift when I noticed a man in his late 50s sitting against a brick wall nearby who looked exhausted and like he'd been struggling for a while. A few minutes later, a couple in their early 20s arrived carrying a tote bag of supplies and a smartphone, and they immediately started recording as they walked toward him. At first I assumed it was some kind of street outreach video, but it quickly became uncomfortable because the man visibly turned his face away from the camera, raised his hand to shield himself, and pressed closer to the wall while clearly avoiding eye contact. The woman kept speaking directly to the phone about helping someone in need today, while the man on camera held out the bag and encouraged him to take it, even though the older man hesitated and kept looking down, clearly uneasy with being filmed. The woman insisted he was just shy and continued recording despite his discomfort, so I walked over and told them directly that he didn't seem okay with being on camera and that they should either stop filming or help him without recording him. She told me they'd blur faces later anyway, and that it was fine, but I said that if the priority was truly helping him, the camera shouldn't matter at all. The guy filming got annoyed, stopped recording, and said I had ruined usable content for their social media page, and I replied that if the footage mattered more than the person in front of them, then it wasn't really charity. They eventually left the supplies with him and walked off, and once they were gone the man quietly thanked me, took the bag, and left around the corner without saying much else. Now I'm second-guessing myself because I may have interfered in something that wasn't my business, but it really didn't sit right with me watching someone who clearly didn't consent to being filmed for content, so I'm wondering if I overstepped or did the right thing. Was I wrong for wanting my wife and infant son to travel for the holidays? I'm a 35-year-old man, and my wife is 33. We are expecting our first child this September, and while we're both excited about becoming parents, a disagreement about the holidays has turned into one of the biggest conflicts of our marriage. We currently live in New Zealand near my wife's relatives. My family, however, lies in Singapore, which requires a long international flight followed by several hours of additional travel. Before we got married, we had many conversations about maintaining strong connections with both sides of the family despite the distance. The understanding was that major holidays would be split fairly, with one side of the family seeing us for some celebrations and the other side seeing us for others. The complication is that my parents have never fully embraced my wife. They were disappointed when I decided to build my life overseas and have often made comments suggesting I should eventually move back home. While they have remained civil, there has always been some tension beneath the surface, and my wife is very aware of it. Recently, another factor entered the picture. My younger brother and his wife are expecting a baby in October, and by the end of the year there will be a rare opportunity for nearly my entire extended family to be together in one place. My grandparents are getting older, several cousins are planning to attend holiday gatherings, and there is a real possibility that this could be the only time in years that everyone is available at the same time. Because of that, I suggested that we travel there during the holiday season. By then, our son would be around 4 months old. I was excited about the idea of my grandparents meeting their first great-grandchild, my relatives meeting the baby, and our son meeting his new cousin. My wife immediately rejected the idea. She told me she is not comfortable taking such a young infant on a long international journey. She also said that she has no interest in spending the holidays surrounded by relatives who have never fully welcomed her, especially while she is still adjusting to life as a new mother. She believes that traveling with a baby that young would be stressful, exhausting, and potentially miserable for everyone involved. I understand where she is coming from. I know the first months after childbirth can be physically and emotionally demanding, and I recognize that my family has not always made things easy for her. At the same time, I feel disappointed because the expectations we discussed before marriage seem to have changed significantly. I'd always imagined our children growing up with strong relationships on both sides of the family, and opportunities for my relatives to gather together are incredibly rare. It hurts knowing that my grandparents, parents, siblings, cousins, and new nephew may all be together while my wife and son stay home. The more I try to explain why the trip matters to me, the more frustrated my wife becomes. She says I am prioritizing my family's wishes over her comfort and recovery. I feel like I am simply trying to preserve the family traditions and commitments we discussed long before a baby entered the picture. Now I'm wondering whether I am being unreasonable for continuing to push for the trip, or whether it is fair to hope that we stick to the plans and expectations we originally shared as a couple. Was I wrong for exposing a co-worker's cosmetic surgery after months of insults? I'm a 30-year-old woman from Canada who has been living and working in Japan for several years. When I joined my current company, I was the only foreign employee in an office made up almost entirely of local staff. Most people were welcoming, including one colleague around my age who went out of her way to help me settle in. Things changed after she happened to see a photo of my fiancé, who was Japanese. Up until then, we had gotten along surprisingly well, but afterward her behaviour gradually shifted. At first, the comments were subtle enough that I brushed them off. She would make remarks about how much food I was eating at lunch or joke that I must have an unusually fast metabolism. I genuinely thought she was trying to make conversation. As time went on, though, the comments became harder to dismiss. She started asking odd questions about my family background, including whether my ancestors had been involved in various historical atrocities. The way she phrased things made it clear she wasn't asking out of genuine curiosity. She also began making remarks about international relationships, complaining that too many foreign women were dating Japanese men and talking about how people should stay within their own culture. But then I realized the issue probably wasn't my eating habits or family history. It felt like she had developed some kind of resentment toward me after learning about my relationship. For months I tried avoiding conflict. I stopped engaging in personal conversations with her and kept interactions strictly professional. If she made comments, I ignored them and focused on my work. Then everything exploded. A few weeks ago, several co-workers were gathered near our department shared workspace when she started criticizing my appearance. What began as joking comments quickly turned into direct insults. She mocked my face, my style, and even suggested that my fiancé could do better. I was already frustrated from months of passive-aggressive behavior, and in the moment I completely lost my temper. Without thinking, I fired back that at least I hadn't spent a fortune on cosmetic surgery only to end up with a nose that looked worse than before. The problem is that I said it loudly. The entire section of the office heard me. Almost immediately the room went silent. What made it worse was that I knew she was deeply insecure about that surgery. Long before our relationship deteriorated, she had privately confided in me that she regretted the procedure and hated the results. Very few people at work knew about it, and she had shared that information with me in confidence. The moment everyone turned to look at us, she started crying. Management eventually separated us and told us both to cool down. Since then, opinions around the office have been split. A few coworkers think she had been provoking me for months and finally got a response she wasn't expecting. Others believe that regardless of what she said, bringing up a deeply personal insecurity and revealing information shared in confidence crossed a line. When I told my fiancé about the situation, he felt I had simply defended myself after enduring repeated insults. But several colleagues have said that even if I wanted to confront her, I should have done so without exposing something she trusted me with. I don't regret standing up for myself, but I do feel conflicted about the way I did it. I know I said it because I was angry, and I know I deliberately targeted something I knew would hurt. Now I'm wondering whether my reaction was justified after months of disrespect, or whether revealing that personal information made me just as wrong as she was. Was I wrong for refusing to be part of a filmed apology? I'm a 44-year-old man, and about 2 weeks ago a teenage girl from my neighborhood accidentally damaged my motorcycle. She was riding her scooter through the parking area of our townhouse complex when she lost control while turning and scraped the side panel. The mark looked much worse at first glance, and the girl immediately burst into tears and called her father for help. When I had the damage inspected the next day, it turned out to be mostly superficial. A local detailing shop was able to buff it out in less than an hour for a relatively small fee. Because it was clearly an accident and the teenager had been genuinely upset, I decided not to ask her family for any money. When her father and daughter came by later that evening, she apologized repeatedly. I told her that accidents happen and that the important thing was being honest and taking responsibility. I thought that was the end of it. Several days later, her father sent me a message saying his daughter still felt guilty and wanted to do something nice to show she was sorry. I assured him again that there were no hard feelings, but he insisted she wanted to drop off a homemade pie as a peace offering. That sounded thoughtful, so I agreed. When they arrived at my front door, the teenager was holding a bakery box while her father stood beside her with his phone already in his hand. Almost immediately something felt strange. The girl started reciting what sounded like a prepared speech about accountability, consequences, and making things right. She looked extremely uncomfortable and kept glancing at her father as if she was waiting for instructions. Then I heard him quietly prompt her to hand me the pie and ask whether I accepted her apology. That was the moment I realized what was happening. I asked directly whether he was recording the interaction. He admitted that he was. He explained that he runs a local parenting and community-focused social media page and thought the situation would make a great example of teaching responsibility and good values. He said he could blur my face later if necessary, but he wanted footage of me accepting the apology so the story would have a proper ending. I immediately felt uneasy. I took the pie from the teenager, thanked her for the gesture, and told her once again that she had nothing to worry about because I had accepted her apology the day the accident happened. Then I told her father that I did not want to appear in any video and was not comfortable being part of content for social media. He became irritated and argued that I could have just let the recording finish because it would only have taken a few more moments. He said the video was meant to be positive and educational, and that I was making a simple situation unnecessarily difficult. I disagreed and repeated that I had never consented to being filmed. I also felt like what should have been a sincere interaction had been turned into a performance. The teenager looked embarrassed throughout the entire exchange, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the video was more important to her father than the apology itself. After that, I went back inside. Since then, the father has been noticeably cold toward me. He no longer waves when we pass each other and seems annoyed whenever we happen to cross paths. Part of me wonders whether I should have just tolerated 30 seconds of recording to keep the peace with a neighbor. On the other hand, I never agreed to participate in a video. I was being filmed before anyone asked my permission, and I disliked the idea of being portrayed online as the person receiving a public apology from a teenager when the matter had already been resolved privately days earlier. Now I'm wondering whether I was being unnecessarily difficult or whether refusing to participate was a reasonable boundary. Was I wrong for declining to be part of the filmed apology? Was I wrong for refusing to drive my boyfriend to the emergency room a second time? I'm a 30-year-old woman, and my boyfriend is 35. Over the past week, he has been dealing with what doctors have described as a viral infection. 5 days ago, he had a severe headache that became so intense we went to the emergency room late in the evening. We ended up staying there for nearly 8 hours. While we were waiting, I tried to make him as comfortable as possible. I brought a blanket, noise-cancelling headphones, an eye mask, and ice packs, and I handled most of the logistics since he was feeling unwell. At the hospital, he was given intravenous fluids and a strong pain medication for his headache. After a full evaluation, including blood tests and a scan, everything came back normal. The diagnosis was a virus, and we were told to manage symptoms at home. Since then, I have been juggling a new job that I only just started, while also taking care of him as he recovers. I've made sure he has food, drinks, and whatever he needs, and I've tried to be patient even when his symptoms flare up. The issue started when he asked to go back to the emergency room a few days later. He said he wanted the same medication he was given for his headache because it had helped temporarily. From my perspective, his overall condition had improved. He was eating again, keeping fluids down, and getting some sleep. The headache was still there at times, but it didn't seem like a sudden or worsening emergency. Because of that, I told him I didn't think another emergency room visit made sense. I suggested that if he still wanted to go, his sister had already offered to take him, especially since she understands I am in my second week in a new job and need to stay focused. She agreed to help if needed. He didn't like the answer and insisted I take him instead. I said no, calmly, and repeated that if he felt strongly about going, his sister could drive him. He eventually decided he would go on his own. What has been bothering me most about this situation isn't just the repeated request to go back to the hospital, but the contrast in how we've handled each other's medical situations. A few weeks ago, I had a serious health scare involving internal bleeding. I went to the emergency room alone, managed everything myself, and returned home without him ever leaving work or checking in. I didn't ask him to drop everything, and I even told him not to worry about coming. That experience made it hard for me to understand why he expected me to take time off work again for what medical staff had already diagnosed as a virus, especially when alternative help was available. I've tried to be supportive throughout his illness, but I also feel like I'm being asked to prioritize repeated hospital visits for a condition that has already been assessed while I'm trying to adjust to a new job and manage my own responsibilities. Now I'm left wondering whether I was being unsupportive by refusing the drive, or whether it was reasonable to set a boundary given the circumstances. Was I wrong for snapping at my father after he blamed me for my brother's accident? I'm a 19-year-old woman, and my younger brother is 18. He has developmental challenges that affect his judgment and awareness of situations around him. While he is capable of handling most day-to-day activities, our parents have always been extremely protective of him, often excusing behavior that would normally result in consequences for someone his age. A few weeks ago, my brother and I were riding home in a rideshare vehicle after spending the afternoon in the city. The driver pulled over on a relatively quiet residential street so we could get out. While I was still in the backseat handling payment through the app and confirming the trip details, I told my brother to wait until it was safe and then get out of the vehicle. Instead of checking his surroundings, he immediately swung the door open toward the road. Unfortunately, a passing car struck the door before either of us could react. The impact caused significant damage to both vehicles. Thankfully, nobody was injured, but the situation was chaotic. Rather than stay and help deal with the aftermath, my brother panicked and ran down the street. I stayed behind with the driver, exchanged information, and helped explain what had happened. Afterward, I called our mother and informed her about the accident. I suggested that at least part of the repair cost should come from my brother's savings because he had ignored basic safety precautions and was directly responsible for opening the door into traffic. That idea went over terribly. My brother immediately refused and insisted he shouldn't have to pay anything. He became angry and argued that it wasn't his fault. Later that day, despite everything that had happened, our family continued with plans to go shopping and out for dinner. I privately asked my mother whether we should cancel the outing or impose some kind of consequence, but she said no. In fact, my brother ended up getting several things he wanted throughout the day while the accident was barely mentioned again. The real conflict started when I got home. My father called me and asked for my version of events. I explained exactly what happened, including that I had told my brother to get out only when it was safe. The moment he heard that, he exploded. He insisted that I should never have told my brother to exit from that side of the vehicle and argued that the entire situation was my fault. According to him, I had been irresponsible and reckless by giving that instruction in the first place. He repeatedly called my actions stupid and claimed I should have known better. I was already frustrated that nobody seemed willing to hold my brother accountable, and eventually I lost my temper. I pointed out that people exit vehicles from that side all the time when they first check for traffic. I said the issue wasn't the instruction itself, but the fact that my brother failed to look before opening the door. Then I asked my father whether he was being ridiculous for blaming me instead of the person who actually opened the door. The argument escalated quickly after that. Voices were raised, insults were exchanged, and eventually my father demanded that I apologize for disrespecting him. Since then, most of my relatives have focused on the fact that I argued with my father rather than the accident itself. Meanwhile, my brother received very little criticism and was largely defended because of his developmental condition. The overall message seemed to be that I should have anticipated his mistake and prevented it entirely. I understand that I shouldn't have insulted my father during the argument. At the same time, I feel resentful that everyone seems determined to blame me while refusing to acknowledge my brother's role in what happened. Now I'm wondering whether I was wrong for snapping back after being blamed, or whether my frustration was understandable given the circumstances. Was I wrong? Was I wrong for going on vacation after my children ignored my warning? My wife and I became parents very young, and for most of our adult lives we focused almost entirely on raising our family. While I worked long hours, my wife stayed home and devoted herself to our children. By the time our youngest finished university, we both felt like we had finally reached a stage of life where we could slow down, travel, and enjoy some freedom together. That didn't last very long. Within a few years, all 4 of our children had started families of their own. We were thrilled to become grandparents, and at first we were happy to help whenever we could. When our oldest daughter asked us to watch her son occasionally, it seemed reasonable. Then our other children started asking too. What began as occasional babysitting gradually evolved into something much larger. Before we knew it, my wife and I were caring for 5 grandchildren almost every weekday. We handled breakfast, school drop-offs, pickups, homework supervision, sports practices, dinners, baths, and bedtime routines. Some mornings started before dawn, and some evenings didn't end until nearly 10 o'clock p.m. We were effectively functioning as full-time childcare providers, while also trying to maintain our own household and personal lives. We love our grandchildren, but the arrangement became exhausting. We felt like we had moved directly from raising our own children into raising another generation without ever getting a chance to breathe. Eventually, my wife told me she couldn't continue at that pace. I agreed, and we decided to finally take a long delay holiday together. We booked a 2.5-week trip through Spain and Portugal and informed all of our children more than a month in advance. We made it very clear that we would be unavailable and that they needed to arrange alternative childcare. Every one of them acknowledged the plan. The morning we were scheduled to leave, however, something unbelievable happened. Despite all the warnings, our children still dropped their kids off at our house as if nothing had changed. Some of them left so quickly that they barely stayed long enough for a conversation. It felt like they genuinely expected us to cancel our trip and continue providing childcare simply because they hadn't made other arrangements. Rather than abandon the children, we took them to school as normal that morning. Before leaving, we informed the school administration that neither my wife nor I would be available for pickup and that parents needed to be contacted directly. We assumed our children would finally take the situation seriously once they realized we weren't bluffing. Hours later, we learned that none of them had immediately responded to the school. By then, we were already several hours into our drive toward the airport. Our phones started exploding with calls and messages. Some were angry, others were panicked, and a few accused us of being irresponsible. I replied to one group message reminding everyone that they had been informed multiple times about our travel plans and had weeks to arrange alternative care. After that, I turned my phone off and focused on the trip. When we returned home, the fallout was enormous. Several of our children accused us of abandoning the family. They argued that grandparents should be willing to step in when needed and claimed we had put the schools and the children in an unfair position. On the other hand, a few relatives pointed out that we had given extensive notice and that our children had simply ignored us because they assumed we would cave at the last minute. I genuinely love my grandchildren and would never intentionally put them in a bad situation. At the same time, I feel like my wife and I have spent years sacrificing our own lives to make things easier for our children, and when we finally asked for a few weeks to ourselves, nobody respected that boundary. Now I'm wondering whether we were wrong for following through with our vacation after our children ignored our warnings, or whether they were responsible for the situation they created. Was I wrong for not wanting 5-week in-law visits at home? I'm a 42-year-old woman living just outside Toronto, Canada, with my husband, who's 41. He grew up in Austria, and his parents still live there. Over the past several years, they have made it a tradition to visit us once a year, and each visit usually lasts around 5 weeks. On paper, it sounds like a meaningful family connection, but in practice it has become increasingly difficult for me to manage. Each visit ends up costing us roughly 9,000 Canadian dollars, where we account for flights, groceries, household supplies, transportation, and activities we plan for them. They always stay in our home rather than booking a hotel or short-term rental, which means our daily routine is completely reshaped for more than a month at a time. I work remotely full-time, while my husband works in commercial construction and often has 12 to 14-hour days. Because of his schedule, I end up being the one who spends most of the time with his parents. There is also significant language barrier since they speak very little English and I do not speak German, so nearly all communication relies on translation apps, which makes even simple conversations exhausting. During this day, my workload at home increases dramatically. I handle almost all meal planning and cooking, usually preparing dinner 6 nights a week while accommodating their preferences and dietary restrictions. I also do the grocery shopping, prep, serving, and cleanup. After meals, my husband typically relaxes with his parents while I clean the kitchen and manage the rest of the household responsibilities like laundry, errands, and general upkeep. Even on top of that, I'm still working my full-time job from home. Another issue is that they are heavy smokers and spend most of the time on our enclosed backyard patio. That space is normally where I work during breaks and decompress after meetings, but during their visits it is essentially unusable for me for over a month. I want to be clear that I do not dislike them. They are polite people, and I understand that travel is expensive and that my husband values his time with them. He is very close to them and looks forward to these visits every year. However, I have started to feel overwhelmed and isolated during these extended stays. The combination of constant hosting, the language barrier, loss of personal space, and reduced time alone with my husband has begun to affect my mental energy. It feels like I've become a full-time host in my own home while my normal life is put on hold. This year, I suggested a few alternatives. One idea was that we use the same money to fly to Austria for a shorter family trip instead. Another was that they still visit us but stay in a nearby hotel or rental so I could maintain some separation and routine. I also suggested reducing the visit to about 2.5 weeks instead of more than a month. My husband did not respond well to these ideas. He said his parents are getting older and that long visits are important to him, and the conversation ended with tension between us. Now I'm left wondering if I am being unreasonable for wanting a different arrangement, or if it is fair for me to ask for changes that would make these visits more manageable for me. Was I wrong for leaving a dinner party hungry after a very unexpected meal? I'm a 33-year-old man, and a few weeks ago I was invited to a dinner gathering hosted by a friend who had recently become interested in plant-based cooking. A few days before the event, she messaged everyone to let us know she would be serving a vegan version of baked macaroni. I'm not vegan myself, but I enjoy plenty of meat-free meals and figured it would be a good opportunity to try something different. When dinner was finally served, I was confused almost immediately. What arrived at the table looked nothing like any baked macaroni dish I'd ever seen. There was no pasta, no dairy-free cheese substitute, and no cooked sauce. Instead, it was made up of alternating layers of thinly sliced cucumber, bell peppers, shredded cabbage, and other uncooked vegetables pressed into a casserole dish. It was essentially a stacked salad that had been cut into squares and presented as if it were a baked-in tray. I didn't want to embarrass my friend or criticize something she had clearly spent time preparing, so I politely ate the portion I was given. The problem was that the serving contained very little substance and left me just as hungry as when I arrived. I noticed several other guests quietly exchanging confused looks, but nobody complained or said anything negative. After dinner, people stayed for another hour or so chatting and having drinks. Eventually, I decided to head home. A few other guests happened to leave around the same time, and while walking to the parking lot, someone jokingly mentioned stopping for food because they were starving. A group of us ended up going to a nearby diner and ordering actual meals. As far as I knew, nobody posted photos online or talked about it publicly. We certainly weren't trying to mock the host. We were simply hungry and wanted something more filling before ending the night. A few days later, my friend called me sounding upset. Somehow she had learned that several of us went out for food afterward. She said it was hurtful that we left her dinner party and immediately got another meal, especially after she had spent hours preparing food for everyone. She felt that our actions implied her cooking wasn't good enough and that we had turned her effort into a joke. I apologized for hurting her feelings and explained that I genuinely appreciated the invitation and the work she had put into the evening. I also told her that I hadn't intended any disrespect and simply didn't want to sit there hungry all night. I felt it would have been more awkward to ask her for additional food in front of everyone. She argued that if I was still hungry, I should have waited until I got home rather than going out with several other guests right after leaving. In her view, the fact that multiple people ended up getting dinner together made it seem like a coordinated criticism of what she had served. Now some of our mutual friends think I should have quietly eaten something later and never mentioned it. Others feel that if you invite people over for a meal and advertise a familiar dish, it's reasonable for guests to expect something that at least resembles that dish and is filling enough to count as dinner. Was I wrong for leaving early and getting food afterward when I was still hungry? Was I wrong for refusing to give my brother a house key after years of boundary issues? I'm a 39-year-old woman, and my younger brother is 35. For most of our adult lives, I've been considered the responsible sibling. I have a stable career as an accountant, own my home, and generally live a pretty structured life. My brother, on the other hand, always seems to be navigating one emergency after another. Between frequent job changes, financial problems, and relationship trauma, there's almost always some new crisis unfolding. I care about him deeply, but I've reached a point where seeing his name pop up on my phone late at night immediately makes me wonder what problem I'm about to be asked to solve. About 8 months ago, he found himself in a difficult situation. He was locked out of his apartment building after midnight during a snowstorm and had his 2 young sons with him. When he called, I immediately drove across town, picked them up, and let them stay at my house for the night. I didn't hesitate because they're family. After that incident, however, he began asking for a spare key to my house for emergency. I declined. It wasn't because I was worried he would intentionally damage anything. The problem was that his definition of an emergency has always been much broader than mine. Over the years, I had loaned him things that somehow turned into ongoing obligations. He once borrowed my SUV for a weekend and returned it nearly empty with several parking tickets I ended up dealing with. A short-term loan of money remained unpaid for over a year until I finally stopped asking about it. Individually, none of those situations were catastrophic, but together they painted a very clear picture. Boundaries that start small tend to expand quickly. A month ago, I came home after running errands and found my brother sitting on my front steps with his sons. Apparently there had been another issue at his apartment, and he needed somewhere to stay for the evening. I welcomed them inside without argument and helped get everyone settled. Later that night, while we were having dinner, he brought up the spare key again. I told him no. I repeated that I wasn't comfortable giving out a key to my home. Instead of dropping it, he kept pushing. Eventually, he asked what I thought would actually happen if he had one. By that point, I was frustrated. I told him the truth. I said I believed my house would slowly become his backup residence whenever life became complicated. I reminded him about the vehicle, the unpaid loan, the pet sitting situation, and several other examples where temporary favours had turned into long-term responsibilities. The room went quiet. He asked whether I really thought that little of him. I said it wasn't about thinking poorly of him, it was about patterns of behaviour I had personally experienced. To my surprise, he became emotional. He didn't get angry or start shouting. Instead, he just sat there and cried. His boys were nearby and heard part of the conversation, which immediately made me feel uncomfortable. The next day, my father called and said that while he understood my concerns, I had embarrassed my brother during a period when he was already struggling. He argued that I could have found a gentler way to refuse rather than listing every reason I didn't trust him. According to him, being honest wasn't the problem, it was the delivery. Since then, my brother has barely spoken to me. Some relatives think I was completely justified because a spare key grants access to someone's home and requires a high level of trust. Others believe I should have simply given him the key and addressed any issues later if they arose. To me, that seems backwards because by then the boundary would already be gone. I keep going back and forth. I know the examples I brought up were real and directly related to why I said no. At the same time, I wonder if I could have handled the conversation differently, especially with his children sitting nearby. Was I wrong for refusing to give him a key and explaining the reasons when he wouldn't accept my answer? Was I wrong for cleaning my condo after my neighbours called the police? I'm a 36-year-old man living with my husband in a 3-story condominium building in Melbourne, Australia. We live on the middle floor, with one unit above us and another below. For the past several months, our downstairs neighbours have repeatedly complained about what we consider normal household noise. Their first complaint was that the vibration from our phone alarms, which go off shortly after 5 o'clock and because my husband works at a hospital, was waking them up. We disabled the vibrations and adjusted our routine, but the complaints continued. They also began objecting to everyday sounds like walking around the condo, opening and closing doors, and what they described as stomping. The building has hardwood floors, and we hear similar noise from the unit above us, which we've always considered a normal part of apartment living. Things escalated when I installed a portable cooling unit in our bedroom during a heatwave. I started early in the evening and finished well before quiet hours, yet the neighbours confronted us the next day and threatened to contact authorities. At that point, we reported the ongoing harassment to the property management company. After management spoke with them, the direct confrontations mostly stopped. Last Friday, I took a day off work and spent part of the late morning and early afternoon vacuuming, cleaning, and reorganising a few rooms. Nothing unusual, just routine household chores. About 30 minutes later, a police officer knocked on my door. The officer explained that my downstairs neighbours have reported that I was deliberately stomping around the unit to retaliate against them after management had become involved. After a brief conversation, it was obvious there was no issue and the officer left without taking any action. The incident left me frustrated and uneasy. We've already modified our routines, avoided conflict, and tried to be accommodating, yet it feels like normal activities walking around, vacuuming during the day, or setting an alarm for work are being treated as unacceptable. My husband thinks we should continue documenting everything and only involve management if necessary. Some friends think the neighbours are being unreasonable, while others wonder if there could be a noise issue we're unaware of. Now I'm wondering whether I'm being too defensive or whether it's reasonable to expect that people in a shared building can perform ordinary daily activities without having the police called on them. Was I wrong for continuing to live normally in my own home rather than changing my routine further? Was I wrong for showing my relatives what happened while they were watching my pets? I'm 34, and earlier this year I went on a 10-day overseas trip. I asked my 35-year-old second cousin to stay at my house and care for my pets. We were very close growing up, but I had distanced myself because of her past substance abuse issues and poor judgment. Recently she seemed more stable, so I decided to trust her. Before leaving, I explained that one of my cats needs medication on a strict schedule and that all the pets required regular care and fresh water. On the first night, I checked my security cameras and saw my cousin arrive with her 5-year-old son. A few hours later, an unfamiliar man came to my house looking upset that she hadn't answered his calls. She let him in, and he stayed overnight. I was uncomfortable because I had never met him, never approved of a night guest, and my pets are nervous around strangers. I was also concerned because her son was there and alcohol had been brought into my home. I messaged her, explained that this crossed a boundary, and she apologised, promising it wouldn't happen again. Over the next several days, I noticed through the cameras that she was away from the house for long periods. Then, one evening, she left after dinner and didn't return until late the following afternoon, ignoring my calls and messages the entire time. Worried about my pets, I asked a nearby friend to check on them. They found several water bowls empty and confirmed the animals had not been cared for as instructed. When my cousin finally responded, I told her I had arranged alternative care and no longer needed her help. I asked her to leave the key and let my friend take over. The next day, her parents began calling and texting me saying I had overreacted and treated her unfairly. It was clear they had only heard her version of events. After repeated criticism, I explained what had happened: the overnight guest, their long absences, the ignored messages, and the neglect of my pets. When they seemed doubtful, I sent them security footage showing the man arriving and leaving. That changed everything. My cousin later called me furious, accusing me of humiliating her and turning her parents against her. I told her I hadn't contacted them first, I only defended myself after. They accused me based on an incomplete story. Now some family members think I should have kept the details private, while others believe I had every right to explain what happened. Was I wrong for telling them the truth and sharing the footage to defend myself?